Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Seville. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1907, a time when Seville still breathed the quiet rhythm of mule carts and bell towers. The old quarter, near the Guadalquivir river, smelled of citrus and damp brick. Though not far from the perfume of the city's gardens lay narrow alleys that few entered after dusk. In one of these streets, Cal de los Desamparados, stood a crumbling house with pale ochre walls and an overgrown courtyard. Its occupant was known locally as Doña Elodia Vargas, a widow said to have inherited the property from her late husband, a tanner who vanished under curious circumstances in 1899. Neighbors described her as polite, distant, and perpetually veiled in black. She walked as if she counted each step, wrote a municipal clerk, Rafael Medaos, in a later affidavit. The dogs followed her without a leash, and they obeyed her eyes more than her voice. Those dogs, 3 of them, large Andalusian mastiffs, were both her guardians and her companions. In the old city records, her property was listed as Casa con Canales, a house with kennels. Some said she kept them for protection, as robberies were frequent in those years of social unrest, particularly after the anarchist riots that struck Seville in 1901. Others whispered that she trained them for something else, something unspoken. According to the Archivo Histórico Provincial, the Vargas estate bordered one of the abandoned warehouses once owned by the Royal Tobacco Factory. That vast building which had employed hundreds of women, the famous cigarreras immortalized by history. Since its partial closure, vagrants and deserters were known to sleep in the outer buildings near Elodia's property. They came and went, uncounted, unmissed. The first mention of anything unusual appeared in a letter dated March 1907, written by a priest from the parish of San Bernardo to the civil guard. He reported repeated cries and strange nocturnal activity coming from the Vargas residence, followed by the sound of animals tearing meat. The authorities took no action. The city police were occupied with labor disputes at the docks and dismissed the claim as superstition. Weeks later, a scavenger found a boot, torn, blood-stained, near the riverbank behind her home. It contained part of a human foot. The newspapers never reported the finding, but the coroner's note survives, buried in the Bolton Médico de Sevilla, April 1907 issue, male, approximate age 30-40, lower extremity, canine gnawing evident, tissue partially consumed. The file was later withdrawn. Annotated, accidental or animal, remains of uncertain origin. It would be months before anyone dared to question Doña Elodia herself. By then, the dogs were known to wander freely after midnight, returning before sunrise, bellies swollen, muzzles dark. When the authorities finally knocked on her door in early summer, they found Elodia Vargas sitting in her courtyard surrounded by her dogs. The animals were perfectly still, not sleeping, not restless, simply watching. The courtyard smelled faintly of iron and citrus blossoms, an unsettling mixture of sweetness and rot. The constables, 2 young men from Triana, noted her calmness. She invited them in, offered them water from an earthen jug, and answered every question in slow, deliberate Castilian. She said she knew nothing of the foot found by the river. Stray dogs, she explained. There are hundreds that roam the tobacco grounds. Mine never leave my gate. Her tone was neither defensive nor fearful, simply assured, as though she were stating a household rule. The constables recorded her statement and left. The report, signed by Guardia Segundo M.L. Cupez, remains preserved in the archives. No signs of disturbance. Subject cooperative. Property clean, though odors present from animals. But the smell, they later testified, was not entirely of dogs. By midsummer, Another man disappeared. A stable hand from the docks named Juan Pardo. He had been seen drinking with friends near Cal Castilla, boasting that he intended to call on the widow Vargas, who was rumored to pay well for labor in her yard. He was never seen again. His friends, reluctant to accuse a respectable woman, said only that he'd left town to join the harvesters near Sica Adoba. His sister insisted otherwise. He told me he was afraid of her. She wrote in a plea to the Ayuntamiento. He said her dogs understood her words like Christians. The letter was ignored. It was around this time that Professor Antonio de la Cruz, a lecturer at the University of Seville, who occasionally advised the constabulary on forensic matters, began keeping private notes on the growing unease surrounding the Vargas residence. De la Cruz, who had previously studied cases of animal aggression linked to human training, compared her dog's behavior to experiments recorded in French veterinary circles in the 1890s. Cases, he said, blurred the boundary between obedience and appetite. He mentioned the case in one of his lectures, referencing the period of social tension described in the Seville municipal reports of the same decade. The same era that had produced the famous cigarreras, women who challenged convention and often lived alone. He suggested that isolation, grief, and secrecy could breed dangerous companionships between people and beasts. Shortly thereafter, Professor de la Cruz received an anonymous package. Inside were two objects: a man's belt buckle and a strip of leather that, upon closer examination, appeared to be human skin, tanned, cured, and faintly scented of lime. He turned the items over to the civil guard. No follow-up was ever recorded. That autumn, Dona Elodia stopped attending Mass. Her neighbors noticed the dogs had grown larger, heavier, and unusually quiet. Their coats shone. Their eyes carried a dull red gleam in lantern light. Children who passed her gate claimed to hear low, rhythmic sounds, like humming, coming from the courtyard after dark. By the time winter came, the locals no longer spoke her name. They referred to her house simply as La Casa del Hambra. In January of 1908, a traveling tradesman named Esteban Corda disappeared somewhere between the San Bernardo district and the southern edge of Seville. His mule was found tethered near an olive grove less than a kilometer from Dona Elodia's property. The mule's pack still held its wares: scissors, razors, buttons, and small sewing kits, but no sign of Esteban himself. The case drew minor attention in the Diario de Sevilla, though the report focused more on the dangers of vagrancy than on the missing man. Around this same time, the civil guard began to receive anonymous notes slipped beneath their door at the local post in Plaza del Pelcano. Each note was written in a fine, almost fragile hand. She feeds them when the church bell strikes midnight. They dig near the orange trees. You will not find bones. Only what she keeps for herself. Some of the handwriting matched that of parish ledgers kept by Fray Isidro Loma, the priest who had first reported the noises the previous year. When questioned, the old priest denied sending any such letters, but admitted that the house feels touched by something that remembers hunger. The constables returned to Vargas's home on February 11, 1908. This time they brought with them a veterinary officer, Don Emilio Serrano, who had once assisted Professor de la Cruz. They found Elodia again in her courtyard, this time scraping something from the stone with a trowel. The dogs remained motionless at her feet. Serrano later noted in his statement that her apron was stained, not fresh, but old, and that the material she was scraping had a texture resembling dried fat. When questioned, she explained that she rendered soap from leftover animal parts. Dogs needed washing too, she added with a faint smile. The explanation satisfied no one. That night, Serrano wrote in his private notebook, "These dogs are not beasts of protection. They watch her as though awaiting instruction, not affection. Their obedience feels ceremonial. His words echoed observations made years earlier in the academic circles of the University of Seville, where scholars discussed animal conditioning and the limits of human command. Studies inspired by experiments from abroad, but applied locally with moral hesitation. Serrano mentioned such parallels to his superior, suggesting that what was occurring in Vargas's courtyard could serve as an example of absolute domination, a reversal of the natural chain. But before he could present his findings, Serrano vanished as well. His bicycle was found half buried in the reeds behind the Vargas house 3 days later. The pedals were bent, and one of the handlebars had deep tooth marks. Following his disappearance, the house was finally searched in earnest. What the constables discovered beneath the old orange trees was not a grave, but a pit lined with ash and small fragments of bone too charred for identification. Within the pit lay an iron collar, large enough for a mastiff, and a ring of blackened leather bearing human stitching. The official report concluded only evidence inconclusive, likely remnants of animal disposal. Within weeks, rumors had spread through all of Seville. Mothers pulled their children from the streets before sundown. The phrase, "La Mujer de los Perros," became a warning whispered at night. By the spring of 1908, the story of La Mujer de los Perros had quietly divided Seville. The city's upper quarters dismissed it as rural gossip, while the poorer barrios near the old tobacco fields swore the widow's house was cursed. A column in the Eco de Andalucía even mocked the rumors, describing her as misunderstood eccentric who loves her animals more than people. But among the working class, where men disappeared without record, laughter came harder. The official stance remained silence. Professor Antonio de la Cruz, disturbed by his colleague Serrano's disappearance, requested permission to reopen the case as a psychological study. His letter to the Ayuntamiento de Sevilla, preserved in the university's collection, begins politely and ends with frustration. It is not merely the matter of missing men, but of a pattern suggesting human agency disguised through beastly devotion. No permission was granted. Still, he began collecting testimonies from those who lived near Cal de los Desamparados. Many refused to speak. A washerwoman admitted to hearing a woman singing to her dogs. Late at night, always the same melody. An old copla about a lover betrayed at sea. Another neighbor, a mason named Louise Roldan, described finding pieces of meat left at the corner where children played. They smelled wrong, he said. Too sweet, too soft. The dogs came first, then she appeared silent, and they followed her away like soldiers. By May, an unsigned report reached the Civil Guard from the Faculty of Medicine. It compared several unidentified remains from the municipal morgue with the previous year's foot specimen. The examiner concluded that both bore the same peculiar markings, a combination of cutting and tearing, with the tearing more precise than expected for ordinary dogs. As if the animals had been guided, he wrote, to avoid damaging certain parts. The note was initialed ADLC, suggesting de la Cruz's hand. Shortly after filing this, the professor's home was broken into. His study was ransacked, but nothing of value was taken, only his notebooks. He left Seville within a month and accepted a position in Valencia. In later correspondence with a friend, he admitted that he still heard the sound of claws on stone whenever the wind carried the scent of oranges. Meanwhile, the Vargas house grew quieter. The neighbors no longer saw her at market. The dogs, once visible behind the gate, had vanished from sight. Yet at night, one could still hear their low, deliberate growl beneath the hum of the city. The parish priest, Fray Isidro, recorded his final note on the matter that same year. The widow has ceased to confess. I fear she has replaced prayer with another form of communion. By the year's end, The old house appeared abandoned. Ivy crept along its walls, and dust gathered in its windows. Only the smell lingered, a scent of burning lime and oil that even the rain could not wash away. Then, in December, 2 boys cutting through the courtyard found the first sign. She had not gone at all, a single glove, heavy with dried blood, and a bone that did not belong to any dog. The discovery of the glove and bone forced the authorities to act again, though reluctantly. By then, the civil guard had changed personnel. Many of those involved in the first inquiry were either transferred or quietly retired. The case fell to Inspector Thomas Oliva, a man known for his cautious temperament and his belief that there is nothing in this city that the church and a shovel cannot uncover. Oliva and 2 constables entered the Vargas residence on December 17, 1908. What they found inside would fill only 2 pages of his surviving report, though fragments of it remain quoted in later testimonies. The interior was immaculate, too immaculate. No dust, no cobwebs, no animal waste. The air carried a sharp, acrid odor, like a tannery. In one corner of the main room, 3 heavy chains were bolted to the floor, their ends polished from friction. On the table sat a stack of folded linen, each piece carefully labeled with a name stitched in red thread: Juan, Esteban, Emilio. But there was no sign of Elodia herself. Oliva ordered the yard excavated once more. Beneath the orange trees they unearthed shallow depressions filled with lime and scattered bone shards, most too small to identify. Beneath these layers, they found something stranger, a series of flat stones forming a rough circle, and beneath them, a hollow chamber lined with tiles. Inside lay the remains of 3 mastiffs, each mummified by heat and lime, mouths open as if mid-growl. The inspector wrote only, "Unclear whether buried or entombed by hand." Word of the findings spread fast, stirring a mix of fear and fascination throughout Seville. The newspapers, though cautious, published small columns hinting at ritual cruelty and domesticated beasts trained beyond obedience. Rumors soon overtook facts. Some said she had fled to Granada, others that she had thrown herself into the Guadalquivir. One version insisted the dogs turned on her after she starved them. None could be proven. The municipal archives later recorded a peculiar entry from January 1909, an anonymous delivery to the University of Seville's Department of Anatomy. The parcel contained a leather-bound ledger, charred around the edges. Within its pages were brief notes in a neat feminine hand, feeding schedules, body measurements, and cryptic phrases like, "They learn quicker with grief," and "The scent of men awakens their memory." Professor de la Cruz, now in Valencia, was asked to review the ledger. He confirmed the handwriting matched earlier correspondence attributed to Dono Elodia. In a letter to the faculty dean, he wrote, "If these notes are authentic, they describe a method not of madness, but of instruction, how to teach hunger to remember." He refused to comment further. After this, official interest faded. The house on Cal de los Desamparados was boarded up, its keys transferred to the Ayuntamiento. By 1911, it appeared in property ledgers as inhabitable due to condition and odor. Still, in the oral histories collected decades later, old residents swore that on windless nights, you could hear a woman's voice echo faintly from within the walls, soft, rhythmic, and commanding, followed by the low, synchronized growl of dogs obeying something long forgotten. By 1912, Seville had begun to change. The streets filled with electric lamps, and new factories spread along the riverbanks. Yet in the southern quarter, near the abandoned Vargas estate, time seemed unwilling to move forward. The neighbors still crossed themselves when passing the old gate. Children were warned that if they lingered too long by the walls, the dogs would smell their fear. The city's modernization brushed past the place, but the shadow remained. It was that year that a young archivist named Lucia Herrera joined the Archivo Histórico Provincial de Seville. She was tasked with organizing case files from the first decade of the century, including those tied to the Vargas inquiry. Among the bundled folders, she discovered one sealed with red wax, stamped only with the letters AV. Inside were fragments of correspondence between Inspector Oliva and Professor de la Cruz, as well as a series of photographic plates, so damaged they were nearly unrecognizable. One plate, when held to the light, revealed a faint image of a courtyard, stone floor, chains, and the shape of 3 large animals lying in perfect alignment. In the corner, barely visible, was the blurred outline of a woman's skirt, the date etched along the edge read Feb. 1908. Herrera's supervisor instructed her to return the files to restricted storage. But she copied one of the photographs in secret, keeping it inside a dictionary at her desk. Years later, she would recall that the image never stayed still, claiming that each time she looked at it, the dog seemed positioned differently. Meanwhile, the city continued to build over its ghosts. A proposal was made to demolish the Vargas house and construct worker lodgings. When laborers began clearing the courtyard, their shovels struck what they thought were buried tiles. Instead, they found fragments of white enamel, teeth, dozens of them, human, arranged in a neat spiral beneath the soil. Work halted immediately. The discovery was reported to municipal authorities, who ordered the remains reburied, for sanitary reasons. Yet one of the workers, Toms Vidal, later told a journalist from El Liberal de Seville that the enamel was smooth and polished, as if chewed clean. His statement was never published. Around this same period, whispers began circulating again in taverns near the old quarter. Drunken men claimed to see a veiled figure standing behind the broken shutters of the Vargas house. She was said to move only when the street was empty, her hand resting where the dogs used to sit. One dock worker, half mad from drink, swore he heard her speak through the shutters. They still remember your scent. When police investigated the claim, the interior was empty. But near the hearth, they found a single paw print pressed into the soot, too large for any known dog, too deep for something long dead. The event was quietly dismissed, but one officer noted in the margin of his report, "Perhaps she is gone, but obedience once taught leaves its own ghost." By 1914, the Vargas house had officially entered the city's inventory of condemned properties. The war abroad had not yet reached Spain, but fear and rumor spread faster than any army. In the poorer districts, where old women still sold herbs and saints' medals, they said Elodia's spirit had merged with her dogs, that she walked on 4 shadows at once. The Archivo Municipal holds a small collection of reports from that year describing disturbances near Cal de los Desamparados. The earliest, dated April 4th, records the complaint of a baker who delivered bread to the nuns of Santa Paula. He swore he'd seen a pack of 3 animals running silently along the wall of the Vargas estate, their eyes catching no lantern light. He insisted they made no sound except for the clatter of their nails on the stones. When asked what breed they were, he replied, "None that I have ever seen." Others began to agree. A night watchman named Eduardo Molina described finding scraps of meat left on the river steps, placed with deliberate precision, as though for an offering. Each scrap had a bite already taken from it. "Someone feeds what isn't there," he told the constable. Around this same time, Professor Antonio de la Cruz, now older and retired, returned briefly to Seville to lecture at the university. During a talk on early behavioral science, he mentioned the Vargas case without naming her directly. He told his students that obedience, once bound to appetite, becomes a language of its own. When one student pressed him for details, he reportedly answered only, "Some languages are better left unspoken." After the lecture, A janitor cleaning the hall found a folded note on the lectern. It bore no signature, just a single line. They never needed words. The janitor, not recognizing its significance, discarded it. Back in the old quarter, the condemned house drew unwanted attention from thrill seekers. A group of soldiers on leave from CADIS broke through the boarded gate one night. Only one returned, stumbling into a nearby tavern, pale and shaking. He refused to speak of what he'd seen except to say, "She called them by name." The following morning, his uniform was found folded by the river, but his body was never recovered. The priest from San Bernardo, now nearly blind, began visiting the site again. Locals saw him sprinkling holy water around the perimeter, murmuring Latin prayers. When asked why he returned to that cursed house, he replied, "Because something there still listens." By late 1914, city workers sealed the courtyard entirely with brick. The site was declared off-limits, marked on municipal maps as Propiedad Clausurada por Orden Sanitaria. Still, those living nearby reported that on humid nights, when the river air turned heavy and the orange blossoms opened, the smell returned, faint but unmistakable, a mixture of lime, oil, and decay. The same scent that had haunted Inspector Oliver's memory until his death, and with it came the sound slow, deliberate scratching from beneath the stones like claws remembering a command. By 1916, Seville's civic planners debated tearing down the old quarter entirely to make room for new housing. The Vargas property, however, complicated the proposal. Its records were incomplete, the ownership uncertain, and no heirs could be found. Some documents even suggested that Elodia's death had been officially registered in 1909 under the name Elodia Garcia, not Vargas, an error or an alias no one could explain. Still, the rumors persisted. The brick wall sealing the courtyard began to crumble from moisture, and the locals once again avoided the narrow street. One of the few who dared enter was Julian Estevez, a young municipal surveyor who had little patience for superstition. On the evening of May 12, 1916, he entered the site to draw measurements. What he described later in a trembling deposition remains one of the strangest accounts preserved in the archives. The air felt wrong, thicker than it should be. I smelled metal and damp hair. The house was empty, yet I heard breathing, slow and even, from the corner by the hearth. When I turned toward the window, I saw 3 shadows move though nothing else stirred. I swear one of them stopped and faced me. He fainted and was found hours later by a night patrol, his measuring tape twisted and covered in bite marks. He left Seville shortly after, resigning from municipal service. That same year, Professor de la Cruz passed away in Valencia. Among his effects, his niece found a sealed envelope addressed to the University of Seville. Inside were notes referencing his lifelong obsession with what he termed the Vargas phenomenon. In one margin, written in a shaking hand, he had added, "If her mind could command hunger, then death itself would not silence her." The university never published his work. It was quietly archived under the classification Animal Behavior, Restricted. Meanwhile, the street where the house stood began to change name in official registries. First to Cal del Pozo, then, oddly, reverted to Desamparados. Some clerks claimed the records simply rewrote themselves. Old residents swore that stray dogs still gathered near the walls at night. They would sit in silence, facing the courtyard, until dawn, then vanish one by one. A laundress living nearby recounted seeing a veiled woman leave scraps of meat by the gate and whisper, "It's time." None of these events reached the newspapers. Spain was preoccupied with matters abroad and the growing political unrest at home. But within Seville, the Vargas legend deepened into something less like a story and more like a local truth. An elderly mason who once repaired the neighboring building swore that beneath the tiles of the Vargas courtyard ran a narrow passage. Not man-made, he said, but dug by claws. When asked how he knew, he answered simply, "Because when I lifted one of the stones, something beneath it breathed back." No one returned to confirm his claim. The entrance was sealed again with lime, and still, on certain nights, people said they could hear the muffled sound of a woman's voice, counting slowly. Oh no, dos, tres, followed by the faint scraping of paws obeying the count. By the winter of 1918, Spain trembled under the weight of disease. The influenza epidemic swept through Seville like a biblical curse, claiming priests, doctors, and beggars alike. Yet on the narrow street of Desamparados, where the Vargas house slept beneath layers of dust and lime, something peculiar was noted by the relief workers. None of the dogs in that district, strays, mongrels, or half-starved beasts, seemed to die. While men collapsed in the alleys gasping for breath, the dogs thrived, their eyes bright, their coats unnaturally glossy. A doctor from the provincial board recorded the anomaly in his notebook, puzzled. The animals appear immune. No lesions, no respiratory distress. There is something in the air here, or something beneath it. One night in early December, a volunteer nurse named Lucia Montero was seen wandering into Desamparados carrying a sack of medicine. She never returned. Her body was never found, though her shawl was discovered days later, hanging from the gate of the old Vargas property, perfectly folded, untouched by the rain. When the influenza subsided, the neighborhood once again emptied. Families moved north, and the city closed off the entire block for demolition, but the workers assigned to tear down the Vargas house refused. Within 2 days, 3 of them had quit. One fell ill after reporting wet barking beneath the foundations. The demolition never happened. Decades later, when the Spanish Civil War began, the site was repurposed as a temporary shelter. Soldiers who stayed there swore they were not alone at night. Some said the walls whispered commands. Others claimed they heard nails scratching from inside the floorboards. A young corporal recounted that his boot was pulled from his foot while he slept, and when he woke, it lay 10 feet away, as if dragged. When the war ended, nothing of the Vargas structure remained but a sunken courtyard and a hollowed well. Children would dare each other to drop stones inside and listen. But instead of a splash, the stones seemed to vanish into a deeper silence, like falling into something that breathed. By the 1950s, the city built a bakery over the ruins. Workers joked about how their dogs refused to eat the bread that came from its ovens. At night, when the ovens cooled, they claimed to hear a woman humming, a lullaby, or a warning. And so the legend of Elodia Vargas, the woman who taught her dogs the taste of men, lingered, not as myth, but as a sickness that moved quietly through generations, loyal to its origin. Those who live nearby still tell newcomers not to feed strays after dark, because once they taste obedience, they never forget who taught them. By 1952, urban development had covered much of Old Cal de los Desamparados. Narrow alleys were widened, modern streetlights replaced flickering lanterns, and apartment blocks pushed the memory of the Vargas house underground. Yet beneath the foundations, the soil had preserved a record that no brick or concrete could erase. That year, a city engineer named Miguel Salazar oversaw excavation for a new water line. As his team dug near what had once been the sunken courtyard, their shovels struck a cavity beneath a layer of lime and stone. Inside, they discovered fragments of human bones, meticulously arranged, and small mummified remains of 3 large dogs. The spacing suggested deliberate placement, not burial by accident. The engineer, noting the age of the artifacts, reported them to the municipal archaeologist. Among the items was a charred leather ledger, almost identical in form to the one Professor de la Cruz had referenced decades earlier. Its pages were brittle but preserved faint red ink, names, dates, and strange annotations about feeding, obedience, and the memory of hunger. Scholars examining it quietly noted the repeated reference to 1907, the year Elodia Vargas had begun her grim work. Despite the evidence, the municipal authorities chose discretion. They reburied the remains and destroyed loose soil samples to avoid public panic. Only a few private notes survive in the provincial archives, catalogued under Seville Urban Discoveries, restricted access. In the decades that followed, whispers persisted. Locals reported seeing 3 large shadows moving along the original path of the Vargas property. Dogs would sometimes vanish near that block, only to reappear days later, appearing healthier, as if fed by some invisible hand. Some passers-by swore they could hear a faint, melodic voice issuing commands in the dead of night, soft enough to be mistaken for the wind among the orange trees. The story of Elodia Vargas remains unresolved. No living descendant has been found. No record clarifies her death or disappearance, and the dogs, her silent students, have long vanished. The city itself seems to remember her. Even modern maps carry subtle warning: streets curved oddly, corners avoided, an unspoken acknowledgement that some presences do not leave. Researchers referencing early 20th century Seville, particularly the social and industrial transformations documented in the Seville Wikipedia archives, occasionally note the Vargas case as a footnote, a chilling illustration of how isolation, grief, and meticulous training could converge into something historically anomalous. Visitors to the area sometimes report inexplicable feelings of dread, a faint metallic scent lingering in the air, or the low, synchronized growl of unseen animals. Those who investigate too closely find themselves drawn away by intuition, fatigue, or sudden distractions, as though the place itself enforces caution. In this way, the case of the woman who taught her dogs the taste of men endures, not as resolved crime, but as a quiet echo through the layers of Seville's history. A mystery that cannot be entirely unraveled, lingering in soil, in whispers, and perhaps in memory itself.